All right, let's get right into it. Today, in this explainer, we are neutrally unpacking a highly charged, incredibly uncompromising document. It dives straight into the fierce sociological tension surrounding how we remember the past. The text we're looking at is titled The Narrative of the White Man, and it explores a very specific, deeply rooted conflict, which is basically the battle over historical memory. We're going to examine exactly how the author constructs a searing critique of what they describe as an ongoing, systemic effort to erase history. It's a fascinating look at how the past is, well, how it's weaponized in the present. So let's jump right in. Okay, let's dive into this first quote. They expect us to forget. That one single sentence basically acts as the anchor and central thesis for the entire document. Right out of the gate, the author establishes a dynamic between two distinct groups, a marginalized group and the dominant group, which is referred to in the text as white society. The core argument being presented here is that there is an overwhelming societal demand placed upon marginalized people by the dominant group to simply erase the past. And according to the text, this isn't just some casual request to move on, It is framed as an active, continuous expectation that serves a very specific purpose.
So that brings us to Section 1, the demand to forget.
Now, why does this demand even exist? The author sets up a really clear dialectic arc to explain it, framing the dominant narrative as one fundamentally built on intentional amnesia. On one hand, you have the dominant group's demand to move on, essentially forging a comfortable false narrative to ignore how the present was actually built. The argument is that acknowledging those realities would disrupt the status quo, so the demand to forget is designed specifically to maintain comfort for those who hold systemic power. But in sharp contrast, you have what we can call the marginalized imperative, which demands absolute historical accountability and the remembrance of facts. The document presents these two forces as completely incompatible, creating this deep societal fracture.
Now, what's really interesting here is how the author attempts to voice the unspoken inner monologue of the dominant group by stating, "Allow us the peace that we require to go about our white lives in comfort without addressing the history that we created." The text characterizes this mindset as deeply self-serving. But the absolute crucial point the author is making is the connection at the very end of the quote, that you remain living in today. The document insists that the past isn't actually past at all. It is literally the architecture of the present day, which makes the demand for peace and comfort an act of systemic denial.
Moving on to Section 2, a history of violence.
The text isn't just dealing with abstract ideas here. It actually lays out a very specific ledger of historical atrocities that the author insists are actively being suppressed. It traces an unbroken timeline. It begins with the era of origins, the abduction from Africa and the institution of slavery, which the text notes involved horrific violence like rape, murder, and lynching. It then flows right into the era of restriction, highlighting Jim Crow laws and forced segregation. From there, the text points to an era of sabotage, specifically citing the deliberate destruction of thriving marginalized towns. And finally, that timeline leads directly into current-day modern impoverishment. The author is structurally arguing that you absolutely cannot look at today's poverty without tracing this unbroken line of historical violence.
Which leads us directly into Section 3, economic and systemic sabotage.
So, while physical violence set the baseline, the document argues that deliberate structural and economic disenfranchisement is what really cemented current disparities. The text lists things like redlining, the refusal of national health care as a way to literally deny healing, stolen inventions and millions of acres of stolen land, broken sharecropping agreements, even the infusion of drugs into communities, alongside racist terror organizations suppressing the vote. The text asserts that these weren't accidents. They were highly intentional, calculated methods utilized by the dominant group to maintain subjugation and actively prevent generational wealth from ever being built.
The author forcefully hammers this point home with this quote, "Putting your towns underwater or firebombing them from the air as we looked on at your attempt at creating generational wealth." The text makes a huge psychological claim here. It argues that attempts at self-determination by marginalized communities were violently suppressed, not just out of greed, but due to the dominant group's deep-seated insecurities and fragile ego. The author claims that the dominant society literally could not stand to see these communities thriving independently.
And, this perfectly illustrates a major theme of betrayal that runs through the entire document. Forget about 40 acres and a mule. The author uses this famous, historically unfulfilled promise as the ultimate symbol of systemic deception. According to the source text, the dominant group has a historical track record of breaking every single agreement and treaty they have ever signed with any group of people. So this broken promise is presented as foundational evidence that the dominant system simply cannot be trusted to act in good faith.
All right, Section 4, the bootstraps fallacy.
So, we've all heard the phrase, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Well, the text takes direct aim at this expectation for marginalized people. In this context, the author views this argument as deeply, aggressively disingenuous. The argument being made is that you cannot historically deny a community funding, steal their resources, firebomb their thriving towns, and then look at their impoverished state today and criticize them for not succeeding independently. And this brilliantly illustrates the author's counterargument. It escapes their notice that it is them that has set the tone in the stage upon which we now stand. The text firmly, and without compromise, places the blame for current impoverished conditions directly on the historical actions of the dominant group. The author is essentially saying that the dominant group built the stage, directed the play, and is now having the audacity to critique the performance of the people they forced into the most difficult roles.
Finally, we arrive at Section 5, the inevitability of memory.
After laying out this massive ledger of violence, sabotage, and hypocrisy, the tone of the document shifts into a stark warning. However, soon there will be a correction and a reckoning as a recompense is beckoning. The author is flat out asserting that this enforced societal amnesia cannot hold forever. The text claims that a correction is imminent, maintaining that those who currently hold power and privilege built on historical subjugation, will inevitably be forced to face the consequences of that history.
The author actually envisions a very specific three-step outcome. Step 1, a reckoning arrives. Step 2, the dominant group is brought to heel and held accountable. And Step 3, unjust historical gains are entirely lost. The text is absolute in its stance here. It claims that the dominant group deserves absolutely nothing they currently hold, specifically because they have never made a genuine attempt to make things right with the people who are tormented to build that wealth.
And that brings us to the final and honestly incredibly stark statement from the source document. We will not forget. It will all be remembered. Expect that. This is the ultimate, definitive rejection of the initial demand we talked about earlier. The dominant group expects them to forget, but the marginalized imperative is an absolute refusal to do so. The author basically weaponizes memory, turning the act of remembering into an undeniable guarantee of future accountability.
So, what does this all mean for us? As we wrap up this explainer, this intense document leaves us with a really profound question. Ultimately, can a society ever truly move forward if it refuses to agree on its past? The text we explored today argues a resounding no, cementing the absolute necessity of historical memory. It posits that historical memory isn't just about looking backward, It's an unavoidable necessity for any truthful future. It challenges us to recognize the immense weight of the past and the impossibility of a shared future built on a foundation of deliberate amnesia. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you next time.